Study of Proverbs. And in studying Proverbs, the reason we want to go ahead and jump into our class tonight is because we're also introducing the Memphis School of Preaching student body, which means we have 10 minutes less class time tonight than usual. We look forward to introducing the students, but we also have limited time to cover what we need to cover tonight, so we'll hop right into it. When we talk about the book of Proverbs, there have been various descriptions given of the book of Proverbs. And frankly, this might be one of the more overlooked or more taken for granted books of Scripture. And we say that to say this: if we would truly imbibe the principles from the book of Proverbs, it would impact the way that we look at the mirror. It would impact the way that we look at our spouses. It would impact the way that we look at our children. It would impact the way that we look at our neighbors. It would impact the way that we look at our wallets. It would impact the way that we look at our lives. It would impact the way that we look at our God. The book of Proverbs can rightly be called wisdom for living. But if we step back and think about what's really contained in this book, it's not just wisdom for living. I mean, that's an accurate description, but there's just a bit more to it than that. In fact, we're going to call it wisdom from heaven for living on earth, because that's exactly what the book of Proverbs is. James would write to Christians, James 3, beginning in verse 13, and say, "Who is a wise man and endued with knowledge among you? Let him show out of a good conversation, a good manner of living, his works with meekness of wisdom." But if you have bitter envying and strife in your hearts, glory not and lie not against the truth. This wisdom comes not from above. It's earthly, it's sensual, it's devilish. As James, the half-brother of our Lord, wrote to Christians about wisdom, he emphasized principles such as meekness. He contrasted wisdom with bitter envying and strife. And he said the wisdom that is from above is first pure, peaceable, gentle, and easy to be entreated. The book of James has been called the wisdom literature of the New Testament, and rightly so. And the very concept that James conveyed in that statement ought to be kept in mind when we study the book of Proverbs, because it is indeed a book about wisdom. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction. The book is about knowing and understanding the concept of wisdom. The wisdom that is from above is first pure and peaceable and gentle. The book of Proverbs contains wisdom from above to help us with living life here below. You've heard this illustration given before, but it bears repeating. When Dale Carnegie wrote his groundbreaking book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, he made the observation regarding the early research for what would become the book, that there was no practical book for daily living and daily human interaction to be found. Now, if you've ever read Mr. Carnegie's book, you know that it is a highly practical, highly beneficial book, and very well done by and large. But we must contest that statement that there was no pre-existing book about dealing with people, because the book of Proverbs is exactly that. As a matter of fact, there is not a principle to be found in any secularly written, any humanly authored writing that can rival the wisdom contained in Proverbs as it deals with person-to-person interaction. So, those things being said, we're talking about wisdom from heaven for living on earth. Some thoughts to keep in mind. The first 6 verses of Proverbs serve as an introduction to the overall book. You might think of Proverbs 1, verses 7, 8, and 9 as an overview of what's needed to make the most of this. 3 words to keep in mind: fear, hear, and where. Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, rather, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. If we're going to make the most of the wisdom to be found in the book of Proverbs, it is going to hinge on whether or not there is a proper reverence, respect, fear for God. The fear of the Lord. And without a fear of the Lord, then the rest of it's all for naught. So it's going to begin with the fear of the Lord, but also the word hear. My son, hear the instruction of thy father, forsake not the law of thy mother. Hear. Wisdom requires learning. That idea has already been given back up in verse 5 when the wise man said, a wise man will hear and will increase learning. A man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsels. The wise keep learning. Verse 7 says, fools despise wisdom and instruction. There has never, in the history of history, in the annals of mankind, there has never been a wise know-it-all. No matter how much knowledge and information a person might possess, once the person becomes a know-it-all, he's a fool. The only one who literally knew it all was the Lord. And even He is described as growing in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. Luke 2:52. So, those things being said, the fear of the Lord, a reverence for God. Hearing, that means we got to listen. We have to listen to those who have more experience. We have to listen to those that have more knowledge and more wisdom. We have to be willing to listen to those who may have less wisdom overall, but may have experience, knowledge, and know-how in the areas where we are lacking, the willingness to hear. Fear, hear, and then wear that wisdom. Proverbs 1:7, they shall be an ornament of grace on thy head and chains about thy neck. If we listen to the instruction that is contained in the 31 chapters of this Old Testament book, and if we truly wear it, not just wear it outwardly, superficially, putting on a show. Folks are plenty good at putting on their Christian costumes. But the book of Proverbs isn't about wearing a costume of godliness. Matter of fact, one of the key words throughout the book of Proverbs in the Hebrew is the word leb or libab. In the English, it's translated as heart. Occasionally, it's translated understanding, in other words, but it's the idea of the core or the center of a person. And the book of Proverbs goes right down to the heart, soul, and mind of man. So, when we talk about making the most of this book, 3 words to keep in mind: fear, hear, and wear. Now, by way of introduction, over the course of the next couple of weeks, we're going to look at 4 major ideas: authorship, canonicity, in other words, does it belong in the Bible? The definition of what a proverb really is, and then the purpose of the book. Tonight, let's focus on the idea of authorship. Now, when we talk about authorship, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, Proverbs 1:1 declares these writings to come from Solomon's pen. The book can be divided, Proverbs 1 through 10, essentially. Proverbs 1 through 9, rather. Proverbs 10 through 22, and then Proverbs 23 through 29. Proverbs 30 and 31 essentially compose their own sections in many ways. But the point here being this: no matter how you divide it, when you step back and you look at the descriptions attributed to the words contained in the book, a case can be made that even the names that appear that aren't Solomon could well be references to Solomon. For instance, Proverbs 1:1, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. Those first 9 chapters are attributed to Solomon from the get-go. Proverbs 10:1, the Proverbs of Solomon. Once again, Proverbs 10 and following pertain to writings that come from Solomon. We get to Proverbs 25. And Proverbs 25 it's really a fascinating chapter if you step back and think about it. The chapter begins with the Proverbs of Solomon, Actually, these also are the Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied out. Let's hit the pause button for a moment. Who was Hezekiah? And don't just say king of Judah, that's already been said. Who was Hezekiah? He was the son of Ahaz. His father was a wicked, raunchy scoundrel. Hezekiah, on the other hand, who began to reign at the age of 16, was a righteous king. In fact, it said concerning Hezekiah that there was none like him before or after in Jerusalem. In terms of the kings of the divided kingdom, Hezekiah was unique. He was one that served God. And Hezekiah, this righteous king that was known for his service to God, Hezekiah had his men copy Proverbs from Solomon. Now you take that thought in mind, you think about Proverbs 25 as being Proverbs that were copied from by the men of one righteous king that were looking back to the writings of the king whose wisdom came from God. And then you look through Proverbs 25 at the different references to prince or king. By the way, Proverbs 25 and really the entire book can be seen as a textbook on leadership. How to influence people, how to lead. Proverbs 25, these also are the Proverbs of Solomon. So even though the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied them out 300 years after the time of Solomon, they're nonetheless attributed to Solomon. Proverbs 30, the words of Agur, the son of Jakeh, even the prophecy, the man spake unto Ithiel, even unto Ithiel and Ukal. Do we have anybody expecting children? Looking for names to use? Agur, Jakeh, Ithiel. Can't you just hear something? Ithiel, get over here. These aren't necessarily names that we would utilize in our English vernacular. But whereas our names seldom have very much meaning, their names did. To the point that occasionally the names that appear might not be what was on the birth certificate per se, but more of a description of the person than a designation of the person. The words of Agur. The word Agur means gathered or ready. The son of Jakeh. The word Jakeh means obedient. The words of the one who's ready, the son of the obedient. Now, whether this means the words of readiness, which comes from obedience, or whether it's a reference to Solomon as the one who was ready because God had declared that he had a job to do. And Solomon was the son of David, who, by the way, that man after God's own heart, and despite his flaws and shortcomings, David was seen as one who walked perfectly before God. He was obedient. Whatever the nature of the meaning here, a case can be made for the potential. We're not going to get dogmatic and certain, but a case can be made for the potential that even Proverbs 30 came from the pen of Solomon. That being said, Proverbs 30, the words of Agur, the son of Jakeh, the man spake unto Ithiel, even unto Ithiel and Ukal. Another translation has, instead of Ithiel, I'm weary, O God. I am weary, O God, and worn out. Some of those words translated as names in the King James Version may well have been statements and ideas. That being said, Proverbs 1:1 attributed to Solomon. The same with Proverbs 10:1, the same with Proverbs 25:1, Proverbs 30 verse 1, possibly. We'll just say possibly. Proverbs 31. The words of King Lemuel. If you go back and do a study of Hebrew history, particularly during the times of the kings, you're not going to find a king named Lemuel. Yet this is the words of King Lemuel, the prophecy that his mother taught him. The name Lemuel carries the idea of one that belongs to God. Now take that thought and for just a second leave the book of Proverbs and let's open to 1 Chronicles 22 momentarily. 1 Chronicles 22, beginning in verse 9. David is relating what God had told him years before. He's speaking to Solomon when he says, 1 Chronicles 22, 9, God had told me, behold, a son shall be born to thee. He'll be a man of rest, peace. I will give him rest, peace, from all his enemies round about, for his name shall be Solomon, which means peace. And I will give peace and quietness unto Israel in his day. He'll build a house for my name. He shall be my son. He will belong to me. Could it be that the words of Lemuel, that belonging to God, that name is a reference to Solomon? Again, we'll say possibly. We can't rule it out. Whether we attribute Proverbs 30 and Proverbs 31 to Solomon or not, the bulk of the material came from Solomon. Now, that would put the dates at beginning around 971 BC. That's when Solomon's reign began. And then moving forward towards around 700 BC, about the time of Hezekiah. The point we want to make here is this. Solomon was not endued with the miraculous wisdom for which he would be known until after his reign began. And God asked him, ask, what shall I give thee? And Solomon asked for wisdom. Some key words in this book. Key verses rather. Proverbs 1:5. A wise man will hear and will increase learning. We've already referenced it, but the wise keep learning. The wise do not assume that they know it all. Proverbs 1:7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools don't want to learn anything. Fools get a headache if a thought goes through their head. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Another key verse to keep in mind, or passage actually, would be Proverbs 4, beginning in verse 1. Hear ye children the instruction of a father, and attend to know understanding. I give you good doctrine, forsake ye not my law. I also was my father's son. Hey, I was in your shoes and I had to learn too. I also was my father's son, tender and only beloved in the sight of my mother. Don't miss verse 4. He taught me also. The one who is teaching was once a student. And he stresses the necessity of being a student if ever we will teach. Which brings us to a discussion that will probably occupy the rest of our time this evening. Let's think about this. Solomon, the human penman, if you will, of the Proverbs. How did he get so wise? Was Solomon a meandering, bumbling fool right up until God endowed him with wisdom? Was he a knuckle-dragging narcissist right up until he just happened to ask for wisdom? How did Solomon come to the point of having the wisdom to ask for wisdom? 1 Kings 4:29, let's start there. We think about the biblical description given of Solomon, which by the way is how he's typically remembered. 1 Kings 4:29, God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding, exceeding much, and largeness of heart, even as the sand that is on the seashore. To the point that Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of the children of the east country, all the wisdom of Egypt. Solomon was superlatively wise. Nobody could beat him at Jeopardy. Solomon was wise, and the wisdom came from God. Now we get that part. 1 Kings 10 verse 23. So King Solomon exceeded all the kings of the earth for riches and for wisdom. His wisdom was so superlative that none of the kings of the earth could match his wisdom nor his riches. All the earth sought to Solomon to hear his wisdom. News of Solomon's wisdom, divinely bestowed, had spread so far that kings of other nations were coming to this nation of Israel, located along the trade route of the Mediterranean Sea, right there at the edge of the Fertile Crescent as you would head toward Egypt. They came to this country that in and of itself might have been perceived as small in minds. Keep in mind, God expanded the nation profusely during the reigns of David and Solomon. But the kings of the earth were sending to Solomon to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And Solomon made sure they know that his wisdom came from God. Now, so we know where he got his wisdom. We know how well known his wisdom was. 1 Kings 3, beginning in verse 9. Here's the scene when Solomon has recently become king. He's offering sacrifices to God. 1 Kings 3:9, God comes to Solomon in the night and he says, "Ask what I shall give thee." Back up in verse 5. Solomon's response involves the following statement. 1 Kings 3:9, "Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people." He's already said earlier in his response, "I'm not equipped for this. I'm not able to lead this thy great people that thou hast given and certain promises you've made to my father. I'm not equipped for this. I'm not ready." Oh, we could stop right here and preach for weeks just on the lessons that can be learned from a man who recognized, "I'm not ready, God, I need your help. I'm not ready, but I've got a job to do. It's time to be ready." How often do we feel ready when it's time to step up and do the work that we've really not done yet, but it has to be done? Here's Solomon. "I'm not ready. Give thy servant a wise and an understanding heart. Let me judge your people. Let me discern between good and bad. For who's able to judge this, thy so great a people?" The speech pleased the Lord, and he said, "Because you've asked this, you didn't ask for long life or riches. You didn't ask for me to give you the lives of your enemies. You've asked for understanding so that you can discern judgment. I've done according to your words. I've given you a wise heart." Now, if we look at 1 Chronicles 1, 10 and 11, a parallel record of the same events, the wording is given that Solomon actually says, "Give unto thy servant wisdom." So whether we just say an understanding heart, whether we call it wisdom, Solomon asked for wisdom. Why? Let's go back to 1 Chronicles 22. 1 Chronicles 22. David is not known for wisdom, not the way Solomon was. David is known as the sweet psalmist of Israel. David is known as, I like the way Wade Webster put together a lecture series a number of years ago when he was at South Haven, looking at the different attributes of David's life. And he described David as the singer of Israel, the soldier, David the sovereign, David the servant. All these different attributes of David's life. There are so many things for which David is known. But wisdom isn't really one of them. Yet listen to David's words to Solomon as he prepares Solomon for what he needs. 1 Chronicles 22:12. "Solomon, only the Lord give thee wisdom." God's going to be with you as you build up His house, but the Lord give thee wisdom and understanding, and give thee charge concerning Israel, that thou mayest keep the law of the Lord thy God. Son, you need wisdom. One other thought to keep in mind. After the events of 1 Chronicles 22, just before he breathed his last, David, in some of his final words to Solomon, had this to say in 1 Kings 2:9. "Solomon, don't you hold Shimei guiltless, because you are a wise man." Before Solomon asked God for wisdom, his father David told him, "You're a wise man." David recognized wisdom in his son Solomon before Solomon ever started to reign. And yet David would tell his son Solomon, "You need wisdom from God." Where did Solomon get his wisdom? He got it by doing exactly what's described in Proverbs 1, 7 through 9. He had a reverence for God. It was instilled in him, and he listened. He heard what his father said, and when God came to him and said, "You ask, what do you need from me? How can I equip you?" Dad said, "I need wisdom. Lord, will you give me wisdom?" And he wore it, to the point that he is remembered as excelling all the kings of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. He wore it as an ornament of grace, a chain of gold. He wore that wisdom. Yes, Solomon's going to hit some speed bumps and obstacles where he messes up. But Solomon exercised wisdom whenever he asked for wisdom. Sometimes the wisest thing we can do is admit we're not wise enough yet. We need to learn. Just some thoughts as we begin our study of Proverbs. Thank you for your time this evening.